generated by, from family or worried about family members, our health, our physical health, our mental health. We're worried about work, we're worried about being able to do work. So I think now, as we, sort of the lockdowns somewhere are decreasing, there's also anxiety about how to act, what measures to take or not to take. So all those questions are leading to also just, decision burnout, and people are starting to experience low mood at times as well because of the prolonged stress. That's what we're seeing.
And Sophie, since the outbreak, what are some of the challenges your team has brought to your attention?
So I'd say there's sort of around 3 to 4 sort of main challenges. The first one has to be communication. We're having to communicate in a much different way. I mean, today's panel discussion is a clear example of that. And from day one, we've said to the team, over communicate, because the way we brief each other to do work, or even our tone on how we send a quick email or a WhatsApp or any sort of message can be completely misunderstood. So over communicate, set your tone, make sure that when you hurry through a message, you do so in a polite and respectful way, because you just don't know how things can be interpreted. The second one would be definitely lack of interaction. We're so used to spending most of our time together, especially at Atteline, and I think any company, most of us work in offices. And that really does have its challenge. And a lot of our team also are just, at one other person. We even have one team member who lives by themselves. And that's, that lack of interaction has its toll. Also, the merge of personal and professional lives is challenging. Not only are you dealing with your own days and challenges and mood, but you're also potentially dealing with someone else's. And you're not just coming home now from work to have dinner with them and to absorb their stresses. You're doing so, every hour of the day as you go through your work life. And then I think the fourth thing is definitely that the days and nights start to blend. Often I called team members out at sort of 8 p.m. What are you doing online? And they said, I didn't even realize the time. And they're not having that sort of the chapters in the day that are breaking up that personal and professional part. And it does have its challenges, and we have to try and work through them all together.
And Bianca, I want to hear your experience. What has it been like for you at this time?
I think it's been a very confusing kind of period for a lot of people. Working from home, I thought would be a lot more challenging than it is, but I think I'm one of the rare people who have actually found it a bit more productive. But at the same time, the kind of troubles and difficulties between not being able to just be face-to-face with my colleagues or pop out quickly to a meeting and touch base with clients, it's made that aspect of the job that was usually the easiest part the most difficult. So it really does throw things for a spin, and you definitely have to kind of adapt.
Sophie, you mentioned the challenges your team is going through right now. Can you speak a bit about the well-being practices in place at Atteline to support employees?
Yeah, absolutely. So our well-being practices we put in place, I know Bianca will expand on this because she had a huge role in it, but they're very much about bringing the team and individuals, within the team together. I'll touch on just a few, and I know Bianca will expand on it, but a very, very simple one is we always had a Thursday team catch up. And this is not about going through work agendas. This is about us coming together as one collective. And we always had coffee or breakfast, a nice moment together. Now we've actually implemented that get together daily. And again, it's not about going necessarily through agenda points of the day, but us just saying, what silly thing did your pet do last night? What did you do on the weekend? What are you having for dinner? Just making sure that that interaction piece is still there. And we also have an account manager at Atteline that brought something called Thursday Feels into the team. And this has been implemented for quite a while now. And she usually brings a piece of content every Thursday to the table, and it's usually video. And no matter what, it always has a humorous approach to it, and it's there to get us all having a laugh, even if it's been a stressful week or someone might not be having the best day. That's the purpose of it. But usually it has some underlying message, be that something motivational, something about confidence, something about coming together. But first and foremost, it's there to get a laugh out of everybody. We also have something called the bell, and we actually have a physical bell in our office, and it's really about making sure that we champion and celebrate employees. So, of course, as many people know who have joined this panel, in PR agencies, there's lots of teams, and we all work on different accounts and with different people. And the bell's there to make sure that the whole office comes together. So when someone rings the bell, we're asking everybody in that office, even if you don't work on that team or with that person, to stop, have a moment, pause, come together and celebrate someone's achievement. So at the moment, our bell is an emoji that's on our team WhatsApp, but we have that. And then I'll just touch base on one more thing called Petracuccio. It's actually something Bianca brought to the table. And some people who have joined the panel might be very familiar with this, but it's basically where we give everyone on the team one word to consider. And actually last week's was isolation, which was very fitting, of course. And you have to choose an image that reflects that word. And it's a great moment because it asks you to be reflective of how you feel as an individual, but it also asks you to present that image to the wider team. So we get to understand that individual's perspective and where they're at that moment. And what you have to do is you have to present your image in less than 20 seconds. So it has a slightly ulterior motive where you also improve your pitching skills, which is very important in PR. But it was an interesting one last week because some people's response to isolation was very positive, and of course some, that image was a slightly more sort of negative connotations that they wanted to talk about.
Sophie, you mentioned that Bianca took a lot of the lead in putting the wellbeing practices at place when she joined. So Bianca, I want to know what it was like when you joined the company. What was the scene like, and why was it important for you to have wellbeing practices at your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I joined, there was already a really great environment at Atteline. It was a kind of small team, so already there's a very kind of familial family vibe happening, and everyone's very close automatically. But obviously with that, it is still the workplace, and everyone, including myself, will have had past experiences where they can kind of build on, what worked really well and maybe what was a bit more stressful, what caused a bit more anxiety, whatever it might be. And when I joined Atteline, I knew Sophie and Brooke from before, from a past role, and just as friends. So I knew that when I was joining this company, I really wanted to be there for quite some time, as I assume a lot of people start a new job thinking. But for me, it was also about, how I don't ever want to be in a position where I don't want to come to the office, and I don't want anyone else feeling like that either. So it wasn't so much about what was missing as much as it was about what can I do to kind of help people feel, encouraged to come to the office, excited to come talk to their colleagues, and where to go from there. And in terms of what we put in place, what was in place and what is now, I know Sophie touched on a lot of things that they were kind of already doing before I joined, but I also took a moment to kind of look at people more as personally rather than professionally. So taking a step back and also understanding, how are you feeling, not work related, you have stuff going on at home, you have things in your life that maybe you don't always feel the most comfortable talking to your colleagues about, but how do you, I guess, release that kind of stress without it kind of exhibiting and manifesting in your workday. So one of the things that we implemented are what I call self notes. And it's basically encouraged everyone to have an ongoing document. We use Google Docs, but you can do whatever you want. You can have a journal, and essentially just write down kind of how things make you feel, how you react to certain things, and kind of learn more about yourself and your stresses and anxieties. And this is something that we'll kind of reflect on in our regular catch-ups, but I would never look at that document. That is very much just something that we encourage our team to do, but it's by no means something they have to. I'm not reading that. It's literally just to kind of help yourself manage your feelings and your stresses and, the way that you respond to things. And kind of be very critical about how you're feeling as well. And then beyond that, I've also kind of looked at making those regular check-ins a bit more regular. So of course, every company will have a review policy and, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, annual reviews. But beyond that, we often look at those as kind of more professional milestones that you have to meet, and you go in, and you'll have a form you have to fill out and an agenda for that meeting. But beyond that, looking at how your team are feeling is very crucial to make sure that, they're happy. And I'm not just talking from a productivity perspective. Of course, a happy team is a productive team, but besides that, you don't ever want to be kind of thrown for a loop where a team member comes to you and just says, I'm really unhappy. And it's been a year since your last sit down, and you're like, well, I had, no idea. And you feel almost a bit responsible that you haven't checked in. So those check-ins have turned into a monthly or bi-monthly, depending on how, the employee would rather that be, just a coffee catch up, or lunch or whatever it might be. But there's never an agenda. There's never, ulterior motive. It is just a matter of how are you feeling, whether you want to kind of have a bit of a rant about your to-do list, or if you want to talk completely separately, just making sure that those check-ins are quite regular.
You talked about the importance of checking in with your team members. So the MEPRA Wellbeing survey found that 41% of respondents have said that their organizations never check in on their mental well-being. So Amna, I'd like to bring you in on this. Can you speak a bit about the key mental health support practices employers need to incorporate within the organization?
Yeah, so, as I was listening to Sophie and Bianca, there's so many things that are, right there that they're discussing, which are key in a mental health practice program for any organization. Increased communication, so important. When we're not meeting in person, we're missing so many cues, in terms of body language, etc., which, give us a host of information that you can't really get from a text or an email. And, it can be the difference between annoying somebody or making somebody really angry, or making them laugh about something. So I do think communicating more is important, and communicating outside of sort of work content is also very important. The second thing, recognition and appreciation, is something that's, again, important to highlight, just as these guys were mentioning. One of the other ways to, one of the other ways you could help your employees is to provide more psychoeducation, more, psychosocial information, have them be better informed about how mental health can be impacted by the crises, and maybe link them to resources where they can find answers. I think the example that Sophie gave about showing an image and relating it to, say, a word, gives you a sense of what they're experiencing, but also helps them understand what it is that they're experiencing. And I think that is by far one of the most important things to do during this time. Same with the self notes that Bianca mentioned. I think any way that you can help employees be better aware of and monitor their emotional state is very, very important, because then they can have a chance at, regulating it. Any resources that you may provide to help manage stress, get more information about managing stress, I think that's very important. And then another point that you guys sort of mentioned is engagement, right? You're not just checking if they're doing okay or if they're just getting work done, but how engaged are they? How committed are they feeling? Are they enjoying still working, or is the stress so much that, right now that's sort of overtaking whatever else that they're doing. So sort of, I think wellness, especially right now in the workplace, for managers is more about sort of coaching your employees to do their best work, right? Supporting them to be able to do their best work.
And, based on Amna's suggestions, as well as some of the things you're planning, Sophie, what are some of the challenges you foresee in putting a mental health support program in place in terms of implementing it at your workplace?
You know what, it's such a good question, because whilst we have all these wellness practices in place, it's only been during really this crisis that we started to think more about it in a much more a mental health capacity, not just a sort of wellness as the word. And we've been trying to encourage our employees to seek out lots of resources and join panel discussions. And I know, for example, at Reset, your platform is a great example of finding a community to support you there. But as a small company, we haven't put a mental health program in place. And I think a huge part of that is feeling that we don't have the infrastructure or the resource to do so. So actually, I'd love to see what Anna, beyond resources, what can we do in terms of steps in a program to put that sort of thing in place that's not going to cost us money from a third party or necessarily too many extra hours on limited resources.
No, I understand. So Sophie, there are actually resources. I know you said what other than resources, but there are resources that can actually make this work a little bit simpler for you, simpler and faster. So I'd be happy to share some of those with you in a bit. What you could do is also have sort of more, right now you're doing an informal sort of feedback from your employees, and I think that seems to be working fine for you guys. The other option could be also doing a survey, just so on a weekly basis, they can check in. One more thing, right, I know that you mentioned Bianca sort of took the lead. I think identifying people within the organization or even, some people have those natural leadership qualities or maybe coping well. They seem to have, healthy coping mechanisms and can sort of take the lead or have like a peer support, with a smaller number of employees doing those sort of groups together. I think webinars, etc., are a really good idea. I know that a lot of mental health professionals are quite willing to do, provide services at subsidized rates these days. We also have a lot of support groups that they could join. But like I said, I think practices, encouraging and practices that help regulate emotions is something that's very key. Providing a space where employees feel that they can come out and talk and actually helping employees understand what would help them, so they can sort of do their own problem solving and own their solution. So that might require, of course, like talking one-on-one, but they could also, in small groups, prepare a few points of how they want to be best supported, because it may mean just identifying certain triggers, like, okay, maybe no emails or sort of no messaging after 8 o'clock, or it could be, could I have a little bit more flexibility? So I think getting that feedback from employees is really important.
And I know that, Bianca and Sophie, you mentioned that you guys used to have team lunches and ring the bell, that's now an emoji and stuff. But with initiatives like team lunches gone and other activities cut back on, especially with work from home during the pandemic, Bianca, has that impacted your well-being or morale as an employee?
Yeah, I think I would be, lying if I said that everything was just business as usual and everyone's perfectly fine. I think being at home for the first few weeks maybe was not a big deal. But as time went on and everyone was, by themselves a bit longer, I know Sophie mentioned we have one of our team members who was completely alone, another who was quarantined away from her family. So things, really do take a toll. And as an employee personally, I know I felt it for sure. After the first 2 weeks, everything was relatively fine, as I said, but then, emotions start setting in. You start feeling a bit stir crazy. Every little comment, might be misinterpreted. And as Sophie mentioned, it's really easy to do that. You can get a WhatsApp message that says, fine, just send it. And you'll think, okay, well, sorry, what did I do? I didn't, I'll go quicker, or why would you snap at me like that? And it's kind of like, actually, that's probably not how they meant it. They probably are just multitasking, doing 5 different things. Their dog's barking in the corner, the baby's crying in the other room. You're trying to find a quiet place because your roommate's doing a conference call and you can't focus. And it's really hard to kind of take a step back and remember that that's why people are doing that. And it's not just you who's feeling this way. And it's, perhaps a bit narcissistic, but I myself was really struggling to realize that everyone else is going through their own thing. It's not just me who's away from my family or, in a house that I, would ideally not be stuck in. So of course it does take a toll, and you definitely do feel it, whether it's, emotionally, even physically. I think also the lack of just simple moving, definitely does play a role scientifically. You don't have the endorphins that you do from going on a run when you're on a 24-hour lockdown. So, and absolutely across the team, we felt that. And I think that's why these check-ins have been, albeit virtual, really important and a lot more frequent. We're talking on a weekly basis, whether it's one-on-one or as a group in our daily meetings, you name it, it's definitely being felt across the board.
So a common thread I've noticed is that, everybody's talking about the importance of communication, or how you're drafting emails and, even what the WhatsApp messages, and how that can be misinterpreted. So Amna, do you have any advice or tips for people on how to sort of navigate the communication end of things?
I do think that it won't always be possible, right, to write a perfectly drafted email or message. So I think as much as we can connect, like Sophie and Bianca mentioning, as much as we can connect, say, on an everyday basis, or even a weekly basis, to see each other's faces and recognize, we're still the same people, we don't have like agendas. I think that's important. The second thing is, a lot of times when we're in very stressful situations, our already existing sort of insecurities or unhealthy coping can kick in for a lot of us. That may mean, I might be making assumptions, or more ready to make assumptions about other people, also about myself. So shaming and blaming kind of behavior, like shaming your own self or blaming other people, can be something we tend towards when we're feeling really anxious and stressed. So I think the more we can be aware of that, and therefore challenge it and say, what other perspectives could there be? And you can only sort of do that once you've physiologically calmed down a little bit. If you're really stressed out and you've no awareness of just how stressed out you are, you can then not really maybe take a walk or do some breathing exercise or take a break, calm down enough, and then you sort of look at the way you are perceiving a situation and then challenge it a bit. So I think that's one way to change that communication.
And of course, mental health does have an impact on our productivity levels and how we, perform at work. And the MEPRA Wellbeing survey found that 45% of respondents said that their mental health had often interfered with their ability to complete work-related tasks. So Amna, on tough mental health days, what can employees and employers both do to make this, process sort of easier?
Yeah. From the employer side, I think that, again, when we are stressed, there can be a tendency to sort of want to micromanage. And I think one of the most important things an employer can do is also manage their own stress first. because there's a lot of passing on of stress that happens, right? And your employee's already struggling. And the last thing that's going to help is your stress being passed on, either in terms of like harsh language or kind of like checking again and again on an employee. So, and of course, like talking about mental health and stress, and so the employees knowing that it is okay to talk about it and express it, because sometimes that alone can just provide enough relief that you can go back to doing your best work. From an employee point of view, I really highly recommend taking some meditation, either courses or just trying out some guided meditation, particularly mindfulness. There are so many resources online available, and even just shifting your breathing for, say, 10 breaths into a more deeper belly breathing kind of pattern can really shift you out of that sort of panicked or really anxious state of mind, to be able to think better, to be able to start having your rational brain functioning again. Of course, like setting up like a rewards for yourself, taking breaks, every 40 minutes. Those are things. I think it's also really important for everybody, employees and employers, to identify what works as a stress buster for you. Of course, the basics we want to cover. We want to be getting as much sleep as possible, eating healthy. When you're dealing with sugar crash, or caffeine crash, that's not going to help. So, and as much as we can, get some movement. But there are different activities that work for different people. And I think even identifying what tools work for you is really important. For some people, it works to laugh and watch a funny video. Yeah, for some people, actually learning something new can be exciting and replenish your energy, or make you more sort of resilient. I think doing anything that's more focused on your five senses, something that's artistic, or some people like to do puzzles. So I think it's really important to figure out what helps you get into that frame of mind where you can be a little bit more present and with the activity that you're doing, because that has a great impact on the part of the brain that's sort of firing when you're anxious.
And Sophie, Amna mentioned about employer well-being. So I want to ask you this. You recently had a baby amidst all of this, and you're working. What's that been like?
Daunting. It's my first, but very exciting, and of course, extremely busy. It's, what, I've been really blessed. It's been such a positive experience, and things in a chaotic way seem to be falling somewhat into place. But I have to be honest, there's also a huge level of anxiety which is surrounded around this virus, because personally, I don't know if I should be stepping out to meetings, or when I can go back to work, that almost fills me with a bit of dread going back into the office. Like, am I going to bring this virus home? It's not just about me anymore, it's about her. And this unknown aspect slightly kills me. Like, can I get on a plane and take her to see grandparents? I don't know, is it worth it? So there's definitely a lot of anxiety around the unknown, and knowing that I necessarily can't do the right thing or the best thing for her, and just trying to find that balance and follow some advice.
Yeah. And, we've talked a lot about working from home. So Amna, do you have any tips on making working from home easier, especially for people with children, or those with roommates, or even if you're living alone and feel so isolated?
Akansha, I think everybody's probably tried all these variants by now, but let me see if I can sum it up, right? Of course, getting ready for work, having a space that is organized and specified for work is really useful. I know people who are taking calls or making calls from their cars. They're using whatever space that they can get to have some quiet time and be really creative about creating a space that helps you focus. I think if you're living with somebody, talking about, what are spikes in your workflow and when you might need support, and kind of doing a tag team, I think works for some people. And of course, like if there's some flexibility that is allowed, because some people do actually work better, say, in the evening. I think being able to forgive yourself quickly and get back up and do what needs to be done, I think is a really important skill to have during this time. Because some of us get stuck in wanting to do things perfectly or wanting to do things the way we used to do them. And I think we need to come up with the new measure, like it needs to be good enough. I think getting some exercise, moving around, using, again, whatever helps you deal with your stress. Because some people will procrastinate when they start to stress a lot, right? So what gets you pumping and moving and builds your morale? Listening to music that helps you. I think those are all ways to sort of try and get your productivity up. For some people, it's just having a quote up on the wall, So it's really about knowing what it is that gets you sort of energized to do the work that you need to.
Yeah.
And recognizing your own work and achievement, like just surviving a work day these days, I think is a pretty big achievement. So we need to be our own cheerleaders a lot of the time during these circumstances.
And I want to now sort of shift the conversation into actually, implementing and having tangible wellness practices in the workplace. And the MEPRA survey found that more than a third of industry professionals feel they're not well supported by their companies when it comes to their mental health and well-being. So Amna, I know you've touched upon this a bit, but if an employer is looking to create and develop a wellness and mental health support program, what advice do you have for them, and what should they keep in mind while developing the program?
Okay, so like I said, it's very important to first of all come up with a mental health plan and identify who's going to be responsible for what, right? So if an employee has a mental health issue, who are they going to go to? What kind of response or support can they expect? I think having a very clear understanding of who's going to be responsible for rolling out some of these initiatives is very, very important. Secondly, like I mentioned, I think having a survey or some way of getting feedback from your employees about what their challenges are and what it is that they're looking for in terms of support is another really important part. And this can be done in small group, like a focus group, or again, through the use of those surveys. Thirdly, very, very important to talk about mental health so as to normalize it. So as to normalize it, meaning that, what the signs and symptoms may look like, what do early signs may look like, what does anxiety look like, what does depression feel like, what does burnout feel like? And then also talking about what may trigger different employees, right? So is it the emails? Is it the late night messaging? Is it the difficulty between work and life balance? Just like Sophie and Bianca are doing as well, because that in itself can really give you the direction of where to make changes in the organization, but also how to better support. So there needs to be a review, sort of maybe even like, a weekly review. If an employee does come up and talks about mental health issues that they're facing, I think it's very important to communicate very clearly, ask sort of very non-judgmentally, and really listen with the ear to understand. I think this is something that's important for managers to have some training in, how to listen to an employee if they're if they're actually, going to that vulnerable place to admit that they're having some mental health issues. So of course, like normalizing it is one thing, but having some better listening skills, non-judgmental listening skills is really, really important. I think a lot of times employers can sort of feel a little panicked and not know, how or what to say. So there are some resources I wanted to guide you to. There's mind.org.uk, CIPD, of course. There's mental health at work.org.uk, workplace strategies for mental health.com, and the APA, which is American Psychiatric Society's Center for Workplace Mental Health. They have some amazing resources that they even outline what are some of the things that you may be able to just, even if it's a start, if you don't have a lot of resources, that you can pick up and incorporate for your organization.
And you've talked a bit about, startups. Do you have any specific advice for them, or is it, is it applicable to companies of all sizes?
I mean, I think it's applicable to companies of all sizes, but I would say just because you're a startup or don't have that many resources, do not ignore mental health because of your employees, because it can have such a big impact on your on your work and output. And time and again we see that there is a very good case for supporting these initiatives, even in terms of returns that you have. So I think there are enough resources out there that you could come up with some initiatives. It's just about, like I said, I'll just touch on this, creating a sense of safety during a time of crisis for any organization is important, right? So clear communication, and often leadership may go in the direction of over managing and not leading. And I think this function of keeping the morale up, motivating your employees, knowing where they're at, and providing a clear direction as well as safety is very, very important, because that's where then the loyalty and commitment to work comes in, which may be the motivation that pulls you over that slump, over that difficulty that you're facing, the everyday difficulties that you're facing, So I think that's a place that if you keep those goals in mind, I think even startups or smaller companies can at least have some initiatives. And checking in being, I would say, number one. Just knowing that, that your employer cares, you exist, and you exist as a person, not just a cog in the wheel. And I think can be very, very gratifying.
Those are great suggestions, Amna. And of course, in all this, we've also seen a sort of, job layoffs, client accounts on hold, people not getting paid, and financial stress and job insecurity were among the top two reasons for employees feeling anxious and stressed in the MEPRA Wellbeing survey. So Sophie, I want to bring you in as an employer and as a co-founder. With COVID-19 now, obviously, there's a lot of stress and anxiety around finances, which can have an impact on our well-being. So how is your company dealing with that, and what conversations have you had with your team about this?
I think, this is definitely a time where employees, and of course employers, but definitely employees can feel very helpless in this scenario. And so at Atteline, we made such a conscious effort to update the whole team at that moment when things are happening, and to basically give them a stake in the role of the company, ensuring that we are, here tomorrow and our clients are here tomorrow. We actually implemented a strategy, react, respond, renew. So reacting to the situation we're in, or the situation a client might find themselves, how are we going to respond to it, and what is everybody's role in that? And then of course, how are we going to renew? What does tomorrow and the future look like, and what would we like it to look like, and really just trying to focus on those three prongs. But it's all about empowering each person to have a stake in not just what they do, but in the company, and how they can pivot and make changes and adapt.
For younger employees, especially if this is their first job, and I know Atteline has a few of them, the entire situation can be particularly overwhelming. So have you taken any steps to reach out to these employees, what they're going through and what that conversation's been like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. I know Bianca touched on, checking with each individual, but of course, some may need extra support, be that the younger ones, not necessarily. And I think this has been a key moment where at Atteline, we also try to empower the different team members to support each other. So champion your team, touch base with them. It's also your role to do so. And I think with the younger ones, that's particularly important, because you can be as approachable as you want, but sometimes it's just nicer to speak to someone who might be closer in age with you, maybe only 5 years difference, for example, and can actually understand a little bit more about what you're going through in your scenario, be that, financial or personally, or just being away from home. I mean, most of us are in a different country, away from family and friends, and it's very important, I think, to empower your team to be responsible for each other, and especially their juniors, no matter their level.
And I know, Bianca, you take a lot of, the lead on checking in with employees to help Sophie at Atteline. And with that comes taking on a lot of the emotional responsibility and the emotional labor as account director. What impact does that have on your mental health?
Yeah, I think I can say pretty confidently that that's the most difficult part of my job, just because I am, as I'm sure a lot of people would identify, I'm a very empathetic person. So by nature, I'm constantly kind of focusing on how I can make people feel better. But obviously with that, you get a notch out every time of kind of your also emotional strength a little bit. If you're taking on a bit of everyone's stress every day, whether that's work-wise, you don't have to necessarily be looking after, or touching base with them on how they're feeling. Even if someone was coming to you to complain about anything, a task or a client or a colleague every single day, eventually that will, of course, play a role and take a toll on you. So I've definitely, I found myself a few, 1 or 2 times just kind of checking in and realizing, you can help also to a certain extent, but there is also an element of making sure you're taking care of yourself. You can check in with someone without, necessarily sitting with them for hours and getting more and more upset and really kind of getting overly involved. You have to constantly remind yourself of also the boundaries between kind of professionalism and what isn't. And on a few occasions, I've actually found myself saying, responding, I'll speaking as a friend or speaking not as your colleague anymore, because I've kind of felt the need to almost separate them, which is counterintuitive. You absolutely shouldn't. And I think that's where both Sophie and I have touched base and identified that, oh, maybe there is a gap. If I'm feeling the need, or she's feeling the need, or anyone is feeling the need to kind of separate, oh, well, this is a serious issue. Now I have to talk about this just as a person. I'm not representing, the company anymore. I'm just giving my personal feedback. And I think that's also kind of, very much helped us identify where we need to kind of grow, I guess, in a sense. But yeah, to answer your question, of course, it does take a toll, and you just have to, whether you're an employer or an employee, remember that there is a time and a place for everything. And if it's starting to impact you, it's completely possible to just take a step back and reassess and then touch back in when you're feeling a bit more confident or capable. And I think that's what at first I was struggling to realize. And then finally I realized, okay, you know what? I'm just going to take 5 minutes, go cool off, digest what is being said, and then I'll come back with a thoughtful response rather than feeling pressured or overly cautious, or like I have to tiptoe, just think about it and take your time.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about checking in with each other, but mental health is also a very personal topic. So Amna, I'd like your opinion on this. If someone is hesitant about speaking to their manager about what they're going through or the mental health support they require, or sort of just, even initiating that discussion with them, what advice do you have for them on how they can approach this?
I think if an employee is better informed about their own mental health, they may have a better framework to discuss it with their employer. So I would recommend, and now more than ever, just recognizing that many of us are going to be facing some aspect, some symptom of like a mental health issue or the other, normalizing that for yourself. Of course, a lot depends on the culture that exists already. So I don't know how much more like an employee can really do. I think it does make a big difference if the culture welcomes this kind of disclosure. But I think it's important for an employee to be clear about some of the symptoms that they may be experiencing. I am feeling very demotivated. I'm finding it, supposing they're feeling starting to feel depressed, right? I find it difficult to focus, not being able to sleep at night. I think it's important to give some of those symptoms and perhaps also identify in advance what is it that you are asking of your employee. How would you like to be supported? Do you just want to be heard? Are you looking for some, resources to be pointed in a certain direction, or flexibility? So I think those are things that might be helpful to be kind of you don't have to give a lot of detail in terms of like what your relationship problems might be, or what the content of your thoughts are if you're depressed or you're anxious. But I think talking more in terms of what those symptoms are and what you're looking for might be a good place to start.
Yeah. And can you speak a bit about, obviously it's quite uncertain right now, but do you have an idea or sort of a sense of what the long-term mental health side effects will be of COVID-19?
Well, there's a lot of research that's ongoing, right? I mean, we haven't seen anything like this before, but we have seen other crises, and we're looking at the long-term effect of fear for our physical well-being. We're looking at the effects of social isolation, and one of the some of the interesting findings that are coming out are coping mechanisms, those of which are unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? When we're stressed and we don't have access to, say, going out and working out, or meeting friends. And for some of us, that those are ways that in which we release our stress, right? So we don't have access to some of our coping mechanisms, and then there are unhealthy coping mechanisms. So they can be an over-reliance on some of those. For some people, it could be, over-reliance on substances or food, or, online gambling, or a host of other things. Yes. So I think that's something to look out for. We're also living more sedentary lifestyle. So that's something to be a little bit wary of, could have long-term effects. And we're looking at probably some, people are already experiencing sleep disturbances, effects of like that are similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. So, irritability, nightmares, difficulty concentrating. Those are some things in the moment, but then sort of feeling a bit burnt out because of the long, sort of persistent kind of stress, and having to deal with changes. Having said that, I must say that we also are really resilient as people, as human beings. And one of the things that I think, like I said, there's so many ways in which that this crisis is impacting us. And one of the things is how much the landscape has changed. Like over just a couple of weeks, things have been changing so much in terms of we get new information, living conditions, working conditions, etc. And one of the things that I found really heartening is how quickly we, we may have difficulty, but how quickly we also do also adapt, more quickly than I think some of us anticipate even. Not to minimize the mental health impact, but I think keeping a balanced view is also important for leaders, and then also kind of promoting that in your employees.
And we just before we wrap up and turn to audience questions, there are a few coming in, including on our Instagram. So, Bianca, from an industry perspective, what needs to change in the PR industry to better support the well-being of employees?
I think generally already people will start seeing a shift in, I guess, more acceptance of a kind of working from home structure or that flexibility. And, whether or not that is work from home, I think flexibility is key. And I know when I started in PR, it might be a bit different, and I'm sure, decades before me will agree, but there's a lot of expectations generally on PR people, or I guess just media people, and I'm sure the same can be said for all kinds of industries, but to just be available all the time. And working from home has almost made that more difficult, but also brought it to the forefront a bit. More difficult in the sense that you do have to be available all the time, because there's this, like Sophie was saying, this kind of confusion between work and life, because you're working where you're eating dinner for most people, and it does get confusing, and you do forget, okay, well, I'm not in the office now, so my emails aren't as important in this moment. But if you're checking your emails in the same place as, you're getting ready for bed, then it does get confusing. And I think because of that, it's, probably caused a lot of stress in the short term, but hopefully shed light on an issue for the longer term. And I think that's where, my experience, at least in PR, has probably, to answer your question, that would be it. The expectation to be constantly connected. I think that's what needs to change, and not just because of this pandemic and the situation we're in, but I think even more so because after this kind of period is over and we're hopefully eventually back to kind of regular office work and then home life is home life, you'll be able to kind of draw that line a bit more. And I think employers often forget to realize that, because they'll think, oh, well, when I started, that's how it was for me. And there might have been more of a stigma or less discussion around mental health issues, than there, even for me when I started, and I'm, relatively young, I still think that it was much less talked about than it is now. Things are changing very dramatically, very quickly. And of course, it's not an excuse to not kind of complete your tasks and do your work, but at the same time, you do have to acknowledge that, if your team are feeling stressed constantly because they can't get a minute to themselves, that has crossed a line. And I think that's the biggest shift that we'll see, or I hope to see anyways, in our industry.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to shift to audience questions now. And Amna, this one is for you. Do you have a sample of a survey employers could share with employees? And you touched a bit upon the,
resources
the resources as well, but can you just repeat that again?
Okay, hang on one second. So what I can also do is, Akanksha, perhaps share a list with you. Yeah. And maybe you can put up on Reset. So one of the resources I mentioned is mind.org.uk. There will also, some of these will actually outline wellness action plans for you, as well as give you pointers for creating a survey. There's mentalhealthatwork.org.uk, workplace strategies for mentalhealth.com, the APA's Center for Workplace Mental Health, and CIPD. So these are some resources where you can come up with a plan for your organization. There's also, I have a list of resources for employees as well, support groups for kind of getting information if you want to provide more psychoeducation to your employees, or get well versed yourself. Yeah, so I'm happy to provide a list. Maybe we can put it up either MEPRA or Reset, and people
Great.
can access those. Yeah.
And I know, Amna, that you have to leave soon. So one last question for you. And this is also an audience question. You've talked a bit about giving leadership training to employers. Can you elaborate on that a bit, about what's required?
I think leadership training at this point, like I mentioned earlier, it's about coaching your employees to do their best work, right? So that means getting better at clear communication, asking for communication from bottom up as well, in terms of feedback, but also in terms of what your employees or sort of first line employees are seeing in the market, etc. Because things are changing so quickly, they may be, I think that's a very important resource. Leadership training needs to include better psychosocial awareness, emotional awareness, and I think a lot of times that means learning to be more emotionally aware yourself, learning what are ways that make you more agile, to sort of shift, ways to emotionally regulate your own self so that you can do that quickly and be sort of be present yet be able to maintain those boundaries with your employees in order to be able to lead them. I think leadership training at this point also has a lot to do with less with, say, managing, but more looking into the future and looking at trends and wellness and exactly what we're talking about today, creating the conditions that would allow employees to do their best work, whether at home or as part of the organization culture.
Great. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Amna, Sophie, and Bianca, and Sabrina and the entire MEPRA team. You can catch a recap of this conversation on our Instagram at ResetFest, and the resources that Amna has mentioned, we'll be including that as well. So, and giving those to MEPRA, so you can reach out there and get those. And Sabrina, do you want to take over and any final words?
Well, thank you. No, that was all from me from the beginning. So I just wanted to say thank you again to yourself and the team at Atteline. We really appreciate you coming together to share thoughts and resources around mental health, managing mental health challenges. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kansha. Nice to see you, ladies. Take care.